Hey everyone, let's jump right into this fascinating explainer about a 5,000-year-old archaeological mystery. Today, we're heading back to prehistoric Japan. We're talking about an era where survival meant mastering a seriously harsh environment. We're going to look at an artifact that has frankly puzzled researchers for decades, and honestly, it might completely change how you think about ancient innovation. So, we start with a bit of a visual paradox. Just take a look at this incredible artifact. It's known as flame-style pottery, and it comes from the Middle Jomon period, roughly 5,000 years ago. Now notice how it's this incredibly complex, incredibly top-heavy clay vessel, covered in these massive sweeping crests. What's so striking here is that this was created by ancient hunter-gatherer communities. You really have to ask yourself, why would people who spent their days foraging, hunting, and just facing the brutal realities of prehistoric life put so much energy into this? Why build a boiling pot that looks like a stiff breeze would completely knock it over? It just seems totally counterintuitive, right? I mean, a top-heavy pot with wild, jagged protrusions isn't exactly practical for carrying around, let alone stirring a heavy stew. Well, for a long time, the traditional view in archaeology was that these wild designs were just purely decorative. Maybe they were used strictly for rituals, simply because they seemed way too impractical to be standard everyday containers. But what if we've been looking at this all wrong? A really fascinating academic hypothesis flips the script entirely. What if this isn't a pot at all? What if actually it's a highly functional, prehistoric portable stove? Let's just quickly trace the timeline to see how this evolved. Way back around 13,000 BCE, we see early earthenware popping up for simple boiling. Fast forward to 3,500 BCE, and suddenly this incredibly complex flame pottery appears on the scene. Then, much later, around 400 BCE, society makes the transition to fixed indoor hearths, or kamado, and these wild clay designs just completely vanish. So you have to wonder, what exactly happened in the middle there to necessitate such a specific, unusual design? To answer that, we really need to look at the environmental catalyst. These particular communities lived in cold, inland mountain regions, specifically the Shinano River Basin, which was an area notorious for punishing winter snows. Now, they were hunter-gatherers, sure, but this extreme environment forced a very unique survival strategy. To feed their people, they had to harvest nuts and acorns. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. These nuts were highly toxic. To actually make them edible, they desperately needed to process them. They had to extract those toxins, along with vital bone marrow from hunted animals, through intense, prolonged boiling. So the crucial question here is, how on earth did they manage this massive fire requirement safely inside a thatched semi-subterranean house? You can't exactly just build a roaring bonfire in the middle of a prehistoric pit dwelling. You'd either suffocate from the smoke or burn the whole roof down. They needed a way to carefully control intense heat indoors for hours on end. And here is where we find our first major physical clue. The soot is strictly on the top. When archaeologists closely examined these vessels, they noticed heavy, thick carbon buildup completely coating the upper rims and the inside of those top flares. But the bottoms, they were entirely clean or sometimes completely broken off. This definitively dismantles the old theory that this was just a standard cooking pot placed directly into a fire. I mean, think about it. If it sat in the coals, the bottom would absolutely be black. Now look really closely right here. Those wild, jagged crests that look so chaotic actually hide 4 perfectly level resting points. Despite looking like wild, artistic flourishes, if you draw an imaginary line straight across the 4 tallest protrusions, they are completely uniform in height. That's no accident of art, folks. That is highly intentional structural design. To really grasp what we're looking at, we need to talk about the traditional Japanese portable stove, known as a shichirin. This concept pretty much anchors this whole academic hypothesis. A shichirin is essentially a thick clay cylinder where you build a fire inside. It draws air from the bottom, acts kind of like a chimney, and concentrates that intense heat straight upwards toward a cooking surface that simply rests on top. So when you compare the two side by side, the massive revelation becomes clear. The pottery isn't the pot, it's the stove itself. Those 4 uniform crests are acting exactly like a trivet on a modern stovetop. The Jomon people would build a fire right inside this vessel, or maybe bury its base in the dirt floor, and then place a much thinner, simpler cooking stone directly on top of those 4 level points to boil their food. Suddenly, that chaotic design makes perfect sense. The deep gaps between the crests aren't just there to look pretty, they are absolutely essential ventilation drafts. If you place a flat pot on top of a fire, you choke it of oxygen and it dies. But with these deep cutouts, The fire can aggressively draw fresh oxygen in and push the excess smoke right out the sides. This completely prevents the fire from suffocating when that cooking stone is placed on top. This all builds into just an incredible display of prehistoric adaptation. When you stop viewing the flame pottery as a simple bowl and start seeing it as a complex heat management tool, every single lump of clay serves a specific physical purpose. It's a perfect example of form strictly following survival function. Every ridge, every narrow contour was meticulously structured to insulate heat, provide a secure grip, and dissipate dangerous temperatures. Let's break it down. Look at the elongated base. That keeps the hot coals safely away from the floor. The narrow bottom? That's designed so a person can securely grip the stove with one hand if they need to move it. And those beautiful textured surface ridges actually provide absolute slip resistance, which is pretty handy if your hands are covered in animal fat. Plus, they dramatically increase the surface area to maximize heat dissipation, meaning the outside wouldn't instantly burn you. Even the clay itself is brilliant. It's a coarse mixture fired at low temperatures, specifically chosen because it creates microscopic air pockets. This gives the stove incredible resistance to the physical shock of heating up and cooling down over and over again. So what we are really looking at here is a literal masterpiece of ancient engineering, perfectly merged with artistic expression. The flame design is quite literally a visual label for a container of fire. It perfectly blends brilliant structural form with a totally vital survival tool. This single invention allowed an ancient people to thrive in a freezing, unforgiving environment, turning toxic acorns into life-saving meals right inside their own homes. It really leaves us with this powerful thought. If our prehistoric ancestors engineered such brilliant structural solutions 5,000 years ago, what other ancient artworks are actually hidden tools just waiting to be understood? How many other museum pieces, sitting right now labeled simply as ritual art, are actually highly complex pieces of technology hiding right in plain sight? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope it changed how you view our ancient past.
Imagine you are walking through, the quiet, orderly halls of a history museum.
Right. We've all been there.
Yeah, and you're walking past these glass cases filled with all the expected tools of early humanity. You see a chipped flint arrowhead, and its sharp, pointed shape just intuitively makes sense to you.
Because it was made to pierce something.
Exactly. Or you see a hollowed-out gourd or a simple, smooth clay bowl, and your brain instantly categorizes it like, okay, that was made to hold water or grain. It's a comforting, very straightforward equation.
Form follows function.
Right.
Yeah.
Form follows function in a very mechanical, predictable way.
And it's incredibly comforting because, well, the physics of survival are universal. As modern people, we're really conditioned to look at the artifacts of early humanity and just immediately recognize their purpose.
We want it to be simple.
We do. We have this deep psychological need to visually categorize an object's utility with just a single glance.
But then you turn a corner, right? You step into the gallery dedicated to prehistoric Japanese pottery, and suddenly that comforting logic entirely shatters. Oh, completely.
You find yourself confronted with an object that defies basically every expectation you have about ancient tools. You're looking at a heavy clay vessel, but its rim is just exploding upward in these massive, wild, chaotic, jagged protrusions.
It's intense.
It is. The entire outside of the body is covered in this dense, swirling web of raised clay ridges that look almost like, twisting vines or flowing water. It looks less like a functional tool and more like a frozen explosion of earth.
It's the absolute definition of a diagnostic puzzle in the archaeological record.
Okay.
I mean, you are looking at forms that seem to defy gravity.
Yeah.
They defy energy efficiency, and they frankly defy everything we assume about the brutal, pragmatic realities of primitive survival.
Okay, let's unpack this because today we are going completely down the rabbit hole for this deep dive.
We really are.
We're going to completely shatter everything you might think you know about prehistoric art. We're going to uncover the astonishing, literally life-saving engineering hidden inside one of history's most mysterious artifacts.
The Jaman flame-style pottery. Yes, from prehistoric Japan. Because for decades, traditional archaeologists looked at these wild, extravagant sculptural forms and just assumed, well, they must be purely for religious rituals or shamanic ceremonies.
Right. The assumption was that early humans wouldn't waste so much precious energy decorating a simple cooking pot.
Exactly. But the groundbreaking academic hypothesis we're exploring today completely rewrites that narrative. These vessels were not delicate, sacred bowls. They were highly engineered, heavy-duty, portable, indoor cooking stoves.
And to truly understand how this specific hypothesis works, And to understand the physical and environmental evidence behind it, we really have to grasp the intense pressures of the world these ancient people inhabited.
It wasn't an easy life.
Not at all. We're going to look at the thermodynamic analyses of clay structures, the specific chemistry of prehistoric diets, and the severe climatic reality of the Japanese archipelago.
Because to build a stove like this, you aren't just playing with mud.
No, you are engaging in high-level thermal management.
But to understand how this unbelievable piece of prehistoric engineering came to be, we actually have to rewind the clock way, way back, like long before the flame-style pots even existed.
We have to start at the very beginning of pottery itself.
Right. We need to look at the 16,500-year-old spark of invention that made it all possible. Because if you read standard history textbooks, you usually hear a very specific, neat narrative about pottery.
The agricultural narrative.
Yeah, it goes like this. Humanity settled down, invented agriculture, started growing fields of wheat or barley, and then, because they had a massive surplus of grain, they invented heavy clay pots to store it.
Which makes logical sense for that region.
Sure, but East Asia tells a completely different, almost backwards story. The oldest known pottery from the Japanese archipelago, which was discovered at the Odai Yamamoto ice site in Aomori Prefecture, dates back an astonishing 16,500 to 15,500 years ago.
And that timeline is absolutely crucial. It completely breaks the traditional model.
How so?
Well, we are talking about a period deep within the late Pleistocene epoch. I mean, the Ice Age. The people living at that site were not farmers tending to neat rows of crops.
They were hunter-gatherers, right?
Exactly. They were nomadic or semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers. And yet, they are creating sophisticated earthenware. To put this anomaly into perspective, the next oldest region where we find independent pottery creation is West Asia, in places like the Zagros Mountains.
And when was that?
That dates to roughly 9,000 years ago. So the Japanese archipelago is producing chemically transformed ceramics thousands and thousands of years before the agricultural revolution even began.
Wait, I need to stop you there and push back on something fundamental.
Go for it.
Because if I try to put myself in the shoes of a nomadic hunter-gatherer living 16,500 years ago, inventing a heavy clay pot makes zero logical sense to me.
I get that.
If my entire survival depends on constantly moving, following herds of wild game or tracking seasonal plant migrations across rugged terrain, a heavy, fragile, easily breakable stone-like bowl seems like the absolute worst piece of gear I could possibly burden myself with.
It sounds terrible to carry.
Right. A woven basket or a cured animal stomach makes infinitely more sense for a nomad. Why go through the agonizing process of creating fragile ceramics?
That is the exact paradox that puzzled archaeologists for a very long time. Because if you view a pot merely as a container for carrying things, you're absolutely right. It is a terrible invention for a nomad.
So what were they doing with it?
Well, carrying things wasn't its primary purpose. The invention of pottery wasn't a revolution in storage. It was a revolution in caloric extraction.
Caloric extraction, like getting more energy out of food.
Exactly. Before pottery, humanity's primary application of heat to food was roasting.
Over an open fire?
Right. If you caught an animal, you either ate it raw or you threw it directly onto the coals or maybe suspended it over open flames. And roasting is a fantastic way to make wheat palatable, but thermodynamically, it is incredibly wasteful.
Oh, because of the drippings.
Yes. Precious animal fat drips down into the fire and is just incinerated. Bones, which contain highly nutritious marrow, are often just cracked open for whatever you can easily scrape out, and the rest is discarded.
So you are leaving a massive amount of life-saving calories literally in the dirt.
Precisely. But the moment you invent a fire-resistant, waterproof vessel, you fundamentally change the mathematics of survival. You shift humanity from a roasting culture to a boiling culture.
The boiling culture, I love that.
With a pot of boiling water, you capture every single calorie. The fat that renders out of the meat flows in the broth. It isn't lost to the fire.
Oh, wow.
You can take the animal bones, smash them up, and boil them for hours to extract incredibly dense, rich bone grease and marrow that you can never access over an open flame.
It's the invention of soup. And soup is basically a calorie trap. Nothing escapes.
Exactly. It's brilliant. And beyond just meat, boiling allows you to chemically alter plants that are otherwise completely indigestible or even toxic.
Which we'll definitely get to in a minute.
Right. But to understand the profound evolutionary leap this represents, we have to look at the chemistry of pottery itself. Because human beings had been making tools for hundreds of thousands of years before this. Stone hand axes, carved bone harpoons.
Sure.
But those tools were all subtractive.
Meaning you start with a big rock and you chip pieces away until you have a sharp edge. You subtract material.
Right. Pottery, on the other hand, is additive. You take amorphous, malleable material and build a shape. But far more importantly, pottery represents humanity's first mastery over chemical transformation.
It's not just a physical change.
No, you are permanently altering its molecular structure.
You are basically practicing prehistoric alchemy. You're taking river mud and turning it into synthetic stone.
That is literally exactly what happens. When you work with raw clay, you are working with a substance composed of hydrous aluminum silicates. It's highly porous, it absorbs water, and if you leave it out in the rain, it will dissolve right back into a puddle of mud.
Right.
But when you subject that shape to intense, sustained heat, a completely irreversible chemical reaction occurs.
So what is actually happening inside the clay at that microscopic level when they put it in the fire?
Well, as the temperature climbs between roughly 450 and 650 degrees Celsius, the structural water, the H2O molecules that are actually chemically bound within the crystalline structure of the clay itself, not just the wetness you feel with your hands, that water is violently driven out.
So it's not just drying out like a mud puddle. The actual molecular building blocks are losing their water components.
Yes. And then, as the heat pushes past 573 degrees Celsius, something called quartz inversion happens.
Quartz inversion.
Yeah, the silica crystals within the clay undergo a physical transformation, expanding in size. Then, as the fire dies down and the vessel cools, those crystals shrink back down, mechanically tightening and locking the entire surrounding matrix into a new, incredibly dense web.
Wow.
You've created a completely new substance. It's now waterproof, and critically, it is highly fire-resistant. You can never add water to a fired pot and turn it back into malleable clay. It is a one-way street.
That is a staggering technological leap for a group of people living deep in the Ice Age.
It really is.
But let's fast forward a bit. Because the 16,500-year-old pots from Aomori are, relatively simple in shape.
Right, they're basic utility shapes.
To understand why boiling eventually became the absolute center of their universe, and why they eventually needed to engineer the extreme chaotic flame-style shapes thousands of years later, we have to look at the brutal environmental crucible these people were forced into.
We have to move forward to the Middle Jumon period, roughly 3,500 to 2,500 BCE. The overarching global climate had warmed significantly since the depths of the Ice Age. The massive glaciers retreated, which caused global sea levels to rise dramatically.
Right.
And this geographical shift allowed a warm ocean current, known as the Tsushima Current, to begin flowing strongly into the Sea of Japan.
And here is the profound irony of the climate. Global warming actually created a regional deep freeze for the people living inland.
Yes, exactly.
Because as this warm, moisture-rich air from the Tsushima Current rose off the sea, it slammed directly into the freezing high-altitude mountain ranges of inland Japan, specifically the Shinano River Basin in what is now Niigata Prefecture.
And the meteorological result of that collision was massive, unrelenting, heavy snowfall. Even today, this region experiences some of the heaviest snowfall environments in the habitable world.
Which is wild to think about.
We're talking about snow accumulating several meters deep, basically locking the landscape in ice for months on end.
I really want you, listening right now, to picture the physical reality of surviving in that environment. You are living in a semi-subterranean pit dwelling.
Which is exactly what it sounds like.
Yeah, this is a house where they have literally dug several feet down into the earth to use the ground itself as insulation. And then they cover it with a massive, steeply pitched, thatched roof to bear the weight of all that snow. You are essentially living in an insulated dirt bunker.
And because the winter was so harsh, and the snow was so deep, you could not simply wander the landscape hunting deer or foraging when January hit. You were trapped.
You had to hunker down.
But the warming climate had also transformed the flora of the region. The area had become blanketed in vast, thick, deciduous forests.
Right, so during the autumn, these forests produced an absolutely massive surplus of food just falling from the canopy. We're talking about an ocean of acorns, walnuts, and horse chestnuts.
So much food.
And they also had access to early, wild forms of soybeans growing in the clearings. Because of this incredible autumnal bounty, the Jomon people in this region didn't need to be fully nomadic anymore. They became sedentary hunter-gatherers.
They built permanent pit-dwelling villages because the food was coming to them.
It sounds like an absolute paradise of caloric abundance, like a forest floor literally paved with nuts, but there was a massive life-threatening catch. The vast majority of those calories were locked behind a formidable biochemical wall.
A very dangerous wall.
Yeah, you cannot simply walk into the forest, pick up an acorn or a handful of wild soybeans and just eat them.
What's fascinating here is the sheer defensive toxicity of these plants.
Right. I mean, humans eat nuts all the time today. What happens if I just crack open one of these specific prehistoric Japanese forest acorns and eat it raw?
Well, the specific types of oak acorns found in these forests are incredibly high in tannins. Tannins are polyphenols. They're chemical compounds the tree produces specifically to deter animals from eating its seeds.
A natural defense mechanism.
Exactly. If you put a raw, high-tannin acorn in your mouth, the immediate sensation is a violently astringent, dry, puckering feeling.
Like drinking incredibly oversteeped bitter black tea, but magnified by 100.
Right. That dryness isn't just a bad flavor. It is an active chemical reaction occurring in your mouth. The tannins are instantly binding to the lubricating proteins in your saliva, causing them to basically precipitate out.
Yeah, that sounds awful.
And it gets worse. If you force yourself to swallow that acorn, that same chemical cross-linking happens in your gastrointestinal tract. The tannins bind to your digestive enzymes and the proteins in the walls of your gut.
So they attack your stomach.
It causes severe gastric distress, vomiting, and if you rely on it as a staple food, it leads to severe malnutrition and starvation, because the tannins block your body from physically absorbing any nutrients whatsoever.
So you could literally starve to death with the stomach completely full of acorns.
Precisely. And the wild soybeans presented a similar, though mechanically different, biochemical threat. They contain incredibly high concentrations of trypsin inhibitors.
Trypsin being the crucial enzyme our pancreas produces to break down proteins into amino acids so our bodies can actually use them.
Yes. So if you consume raw wild soybeans, the inhibitors neutralize your trypsin. Your protein digestion simply shuts down.
Wow.
To survive the freezing 6-month winter, the Jomon people had to rely entirely on these toxic stores of food. Therefore, they had to engineer a massive biochemical intervention.
And you can't just toss an acorn into the fire and roost the tannins away, can you?
No, heat alone does not destroy high concentrations of tannins effectively. You have to leach them out. You have to physically pull the toxic compounds out of the cellular structure of the nut.
Right.
And to do that efficiently with these specific acorns, you need water, sustained high heat, and a chemical catalyst.
Okay, let's break down the chemistry of this prehistoric food processing, because this is where the genius of these people really shines. They used alkaline water.
They did. They discovered that by taking the white ash left over from their wood fires and mixing it into a pot of water, they created an alkaline solution.
From just wood ash.
Yeah, wood ash is highly concentrated in potassium carbonate and potassium hydroxide.
Which is essentially a primitive form of lye.
Exactly. It raises the pH of the water significantly. When you boil the cracked acorns in this alkaline ash water, the heat softens the cellular walls of the nut, and the alkaline solution chemically breaks the strong bonds of the tannin polymers.
It rips them apart.
It neutralizes them and draws them out into the water. You then pour off the dark, bitter water, add fresh water, and boil them again until the food is safe to eat.
But this isn't a quick 10-minute process we're talking about here.
Oh, not at all.
We are talking about hours, sometimes days, of continuous, violent, rolling boiling to render a single batch of acorns edible. And you have an entire extended family living in this pit dwelling that needs to eat every single day of the winter.
And that reality creates a dire, inescapable need for advanced thermal management. Think about the architecture we just discussed. You are inside a small, semi-subterranean dirt bunker with a highly flammable roof made of dried grass and thatch.
And the traditional way early humans managed fire indoors was the ground hearth, right? You just dig a shallow depression in the center of the dirt floor, throw some wood in, and light it.
But a ground hearth is incredibly inefficient and exceptionally dangerous for this specific task.
Yeah.
If you need a fire burning hot enough to maintain a rolling boil for 24 hours a day, an open fire in a shallow dirt pit is a massive hazard.
Sparks are popping everywhere.
Sparks are popping and flying upward toward that dry thatch roof. Embers are rolling across the floor.
Not to mention the heat loss. If I build a fire on the flat ground, the heat radiates outward in 360 degrees horizontally. It warms my shins, sure, but a huge percentage of that thermal energy is just bleeding out into the dirt walls of the pit dwelling.
It's wasted energy.
It's not being concentrated where I need it, which is directly under my boiling pot.
So they needed a way to control the fire. They needed to contain the embers, physically direct the thermal energy strictly upward toward the food, and make the entire process safe enough to operate continuously indoors without burning the village down.
They needed an integrated physical system to harness combustion, and this brings us to the central revelation of our deep dive. Enter the flame-style pottery.
Right. For a very long time, the traditional archaeological community looked at these wildly decorated flame-style vessels with their heavy, chaotic textures and those four massive, sweeping, jagged protrusions extending high above the rim, and they concluded almost universally that these had to be non-utilitarian objects.
It was almost a prejudice against prehistoric art, wasn't it? The prevailing thought was that as human societies advance, especially once they become agricultural, they realize the value of efficiency. Their pots become smooth, uniform, thin-walled, and simple.
The assumption of progress.
Right. The traditional view assumed that the wildly complex decoration of the Jomons was proof of a primitive, highly superstitious mindset that was willing to waste vast amounts of precious calories on useless aesthetics.
They looked at it and saw a ritual artifact. But the hypothesis we are examining today completely upends that assumption. When we apply thermodynamics, material science, and an understanding of combustion physics to the anatomy of this object, a completely different picture emerges.
It wasn't just a bowl.
No, the flame-style pottery was not a delicate bowl for shamanic rituals. It was a heavy-duty, highly engineered, portable indoor stove.
It was an instrument of survival. To understand it, we have to stop looking at it as a container meant to hold soup and start looking at it as an integrated combustion chamber. Let's break down the physical structure of this stove, starting with the most obvious feature, the flames themselves.
The visual design.
Right. The traditional view says those wild, jagged shapes on the rim are just artistic representations of fire, like a spiritual homage to the hearth. But the engineering view suggests this is a highly calculated visual indicator.
A prehistoric warning label.
Exactly. Think about the environment we just painted. You are in a semi-subterranean pit dwelling in the dead of winter. The only light comes from the central fire, or perhaps a small opening near the roof. The air is thick with wood smoke.
Visibility is incredibly low.
Right, and scattered around the floor of this dwelling are various pots and baskets. Some hold drinking water, some hold processed seeds or dried meat, and one specific heavy clay vessel contains a raging hundreds-of-degree fire.
That's a huge hazard.
If you are stumbling around in the dim light, or if you have a young child running across the dirt floor, you need to instantly, universally know which vessel is the thermal hazard.
So the chaotic, exaggerated flame design acts as a prehistoric safety marker. It communicates instantaneously and from any angle, this is the fire vessel. Do not touch this.
It is a brilliant piece of visual communication, but the engineering goes so much deeper than just a warning. Let's look at the shape of the vessel's main body. If you look at a classic flame-style pot, the body is distinctly tall and elongated, almost cylindrical before it tapers down. Why not make it wide and squat?
That elongated shape is a deliberate thermodynamic decision concerning heat transfer. When you have a live fire burning inside the upper half of a clay vessel, that extreme heat takes time to travel via conduction down the clay wall.
Because clay isn't metal.
Right, clay is a relatively poor conductor of heat compared to metal, but it does heat up eventually. By making the body exceptionally tall, the Jomon engineers artificially extended the distance the heat had to travel.
They bought themselves some time.
Exactly. They created a thermal gradient. The top rim where the fire is burning might be incredibly hot, but the bottom section remains significantly cooler.
And let's talk about that bottom section. It is specifically tapered. It gets very narrow at the base. Now, if I am designing a heavy pot to hold a raging fire, my first instinct would be to make the bottom as wide and flat as possible so it never tips over. A narrow base seems completely counterintuitive. Why make it narrow?
Because of portability. A wide, flat bottom would indeed be stable, but it would be nearly impossible to pick up.
Oh, because it's so wide.
Right. If the top of the vessel is radiating intense heat, you cannot wrap your arms around it to move it. By tapering the bottom into a narrow, cooler cone, an ancient user could safely reach down and grab the very base of this active stove with one hand.
They could literally pick up a contained fire and carry it across the room.
Exactly.
If the smoke was getting too thick in the back of the dwelling, they could carry the stove closer to the door. If they needed to boil acorns in a different corner, they just moved the firebox. It is brilliant.
It is. The bottom half is designed entirely for safe handling and thermal isolation. But the top half is where the active combustion physics take place. And this brings us to the most brilliant, sophisticated piece of prehistoric engineering on the entire vessel.
Yes. Let's talk about the rim, because we don't just have random flames. We consistently see 4 very prominent uniform protrusions sticking straight up from the top of the vessel.
They look almost like 4 small towers or crowns.
Right. And the art history view said, oh, those are just decorative coxcombs. But the engineering view says, no, that is a highly calibrated trivet.
Let's walk through the basic physics of cooking over a contained fire. If I have a fire burning inside a clay pot and I want to boil water, I need to put a second pot on top of it.
Sure.
If I take a flat-bottom cooking pot and rest it directly on top of the rim of my firebox, what happens?
You completely seal the opening, you smother the fire, you cut off all the oxygen, and within seconds, your coals just die out.
Right. Combustion requires an uninterrupted, continuous supply of oxygen. In a modern kitchen, if you look at a gas stove, you have a heavy iron trivet that sits over the burner. The pan rests on the trivet, hovering an inch or two above the actual flame, allowing ambient air to flow freely underneath the pan to feed the combustion.
And the Jomon did that with clay.
The Jomon engineers achieved that exact same thermodynamic function utilizing only clay. Those 4 massive protrusions extending from the rim are remarkably uniform in height.
They are perfectly level.
Yes, they are designed to act as a stable cradle. You take a secondary cooking vessel, a thinner, plainer pot that actually contains your alkaline water and your acorns, and you sit it directly on top of those 4 protrusions.
It's exactly like setting up a survival campfire. You find 4 rocks of the exact same height, you arrange them in a tight circle, you build your tinder and kindling inside the circle, and you rest your flat cooking stone or your frying pan on the rocks.
It's the exact same principle.
Except the Jomon people engineered that entire precise setup flawlessly into a single, cohesive, portable clay unit.
But the genius of the rim doesn't stop at simply holding the upper pot. It goes much deeper into active ventilation.
The draft holes.
Yes, look closely at the negative space between those 4 protrusions. The rim isn't just open air. The Jomon potters carved deep, deliberate U-shaped grooves and large circular holes directly into the clay walls just below the upper rim.
So they pierced the walls of the firebox. A traditional archaeologist might say, oh, they just carved holes to make it look lighter or to string ceremonial ropes through it.
But an engineer looks at those specific holes and immediately recognizes a draft ventilation system. They harnessed a principle of thermodynamics known as the stack effect or the chimney effect.
Okay, break that down for us. How does the chimney effect actually work inside a prehistoric clay pot?
It comes down to air density and pressure differentials. When you have live coals burning inside the upper half of the flame-style pot, the air immediately surrounding those coals heats up rapidly.
And hot air rises.
Exactly. Hot air is less dense than cold air, so it naturally wants to rise. As this hot air carrying all that thick smoke rushes upward, it hits the bottom of the secondary cooking pot resting on the trivets. It is forced to escape outward through those specifically carved U-shaped grooves in the circular holes.
So the smoke is being actively vented horizontally out the sides, rather than just billowing straight up into the cook's face.
Exactly. But here is the critical part. As that hot air rapidly exits the top of the firebox, it creates a localized zone of low air pressure at the bottom of the combustion area.
It creates a vacuum.
And nature abhors a vacuum. To equalize the pressure, heavier, colder, highly oxygenated ambient air from the floor of the pit dwelling is aggressively drawn inward through the lower gaps to replace the rising hot air.
It's literally breathing. It is sucking in fresh oxygen from the bottom of the fire, supercharging the coals, and exhaling the exhaust smoke out the pop vents. It is a continuous, self-sustaining thermodynamic engine.
Precisely. They engineered a mechanism to maintain a violent, high-heat continuous boil indoors, maximizing oxygen flow while securely cradling the cooking pot above the coals.
Now, I can hear the skeptics listening to this right now. They might be thinking, this is an incredibly elegant theory. It makes perfect logical sense. But it's just a theory. You are looking at a 5,000-year-old piece of clay and guessing. How can you possibly prove that the flame-style pot was used to hold a fire, rather than just being a regular soup pot that got pushed into a fire?
That is the burden of archaeological proof, and thankfully we have the ultimate physical evidence, the smoking gun, literally. We have the soot.
Okay, this is where the detective work gets amazing. Tell us about the soot.
When modern archaeologists meticulously excavated these specific flame-style pots from undisturbed sites in the Shinano River Basin, they didn't just wash them off. They conducted rigorous microscopic and chemical analyses of the carbon deposits. The soot left baked onto the clay surfaces.
Right. And if the traditional theory was correct, if this was just a really fancy pot used to hold acorn soup, and they just shoved it into a roaring ground hearth to boil it, where would you expect to find the soot?
If you push a vessel into a ground fire, the flames, the burning logs, and the smoldering coals are wrapping around the bottom and the lower exterior walls of the pot. Therefore, the heaviest, thickest accumulation of blackened, polymerized carbon would be concentrated strictly on the bottom exterior.
Because that is the surface physically interacting with the fire.
Exactly. But when they analyzed the flame-style pots, the empirical findings were the exact opposite. The lower half of these vessels, and particularly the tapered bottom, is frequently found completely clean of any soot or thermal scorching whatsoever.
It's completely clean.
Yes. Sometimes the very bottom is physically degraded from sitting in damp, acidic soil for 5 millennia, but it is not burned.
Wait, I have to play devil's advocate here. Couldn't the soot on the bottom just have washed away over 5,000 years of being buried in the dirt?
It is a valid question, but carbon specifically baked on soot is incredibly chemically stable. It does not dissolve easily in groundwater. We find thousands of other Jomon plots from different eras where the bottoms are thoroughly blackened and the soot has survived perfectly.
So the lack of soot is real.
It is real. But on the flame-style pots, the heavy blackened soot is concentrated exclusively on the upper half of the vessel. It is heavily caked on the interior of the rim, inside the 4 protrusions, and specifically clustered around the edges of those draft holes we discussed.
The fire wasn't underneath the pot. The fire was inside the top of the pot.
The physical evidence is undeniable. Either the vessel was used as a freestanding portable firebox with the coals loaded directly into the top half, or, in some cases, the bottom half of the vessel was buried into the dirt floor of the dwelling to act as a fixed hearth liner, and the fire was built inside the exposed upper rim.
Either way, the heat source was contained at the top.
Right. In either scenario, the heat source was interacting almost entirely with the upper section. It wasn't the pot being cooked. The pot was the instrument holding the fire.
It fundamentally changes how we are forced to view their technological sophistication. Okay, so we have solved the thermal isolation of the narrow bottom. We have solved the combustion physics, the trivet, and the drafted ventilation system at the top. But we still need to address the vast majority of the vessel. We have to talk about the outside.
The exterior texture.
Yes. If you look at a flame-style pot, the main body is not smooth. It is covered in a chaotic, dense, incredibly intricate web of raised clay lines, swirling ridges, spirals, and bumps. If I am a potter, smoothing out the sides of a bowl with a wet stone is relatively quick and easy.
It is.
Rolling out hundreds of tiny clay ropes and painstakingly attaching them in complex webs all over the outside of the vessel takes an immense amount of time, precision, and skill. Why invest all that labor? Our analysis suggests that this texture serves 2 highly critical, life-saving physical functions: heat dissipation and grip safety.
Let's explore the thermodynamic principle of surface area first. Imagine you have a perfectly smooth clay pot, and you fill the inside with a raging 600-degree fire. Heat transfers via conduction from the inside wall to the outside wall. A perfectly smooth surface has a very limited geometric area to radiate that accumulated heat out into the surrounding air.
So the heat gets trapped in the wall. The wall gets hotter and hotter.
Precisely. It becomes a severe thermal hazard. If you accidentally brush your leg against it in a cramped pit dwelling, you suffer a catastrophic 3rd-degree burn. But if you look at how human engineers solve this problem today, look at the engine block of an air-cooled motorcycle or the heat dissipator on a high-performance computer processor.
They're covered in dozens of thin, raised metal ridges.
Right. By creating a jagged, heavily raised texture on the outside of the clay, the Jomon potters drastically multiplied the total surface area of the vessel exposed to the cooler ambient air of the dwelling.
It's acting like a radiator.
Yes. This vastly increased surface area allows the vessel to radiate thermal energy away much more rapidly and efficiently. The complex raised lines catch the subtle cooler air currents moving across the floor, drawing the heat out of the clay and cooling the exterior surface significantly faster than a smooth pot ever could.
It is a prehistoric heat dissipator. But I want to push back again and bring this out of the realm of pure physics and back to the practical human reality of daily life. I try to imagine a prehistoric person physically interacting with this object. I bring up the reality of the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. Think about what these people are doing all day.
They're working with their hands?
Exactly. They're butchering deer. They are processing fish caught in the river. They are boiling down oily nuts. Their hands are constantly going to be covered in animal fat, fish oil, plant resins, and water.
You are describing a physical environment with incredibly low surface friction.
Right. Imagine trying to pick up a heavy, smooth clay pot filled with hot coals when your hands are heavily greased with deer fat. It is a deadly slip hazard. Even if you added simple loop handles, oily fingers can easily slip out, and the stakes are incredibly high.
They couldn't afford to drop it.
If you drop a portable stove full of live burning coals inside a house made entirely of dry thatch and wood, the entire structure goes up in flames. Your family perishes, your winter food stores are destroyed, and your village could burn down.
And that terrifying reality reveals the true brilliance of the exterior texture. The chaotic, swirling web of raised lines provides intense, inescapable physical friction from absolutely any angle of approach.
It's functional grip tape.
Whether you are grabbing the vessel from the very bottom, clutching it by the side, or bracing it with your forearms, your oily fingers and skin are going to mechanically lock into those deep, abrasive grooves.
It is the ultimate omnidirectional ergonomic grip. It ensures that the heavy hot stove never, ever slips, regardless of how slick your hands are. It is a vital safety mechanism masquerading as chaotic art.
And the engineering of safety didn't stop at the macro shape. It went all the way down to the microscopic chemistry of the clay itself. We talked earlier about how clay chemically turns to dense stone when fired. But not all ceramics react to heat the same way.
What do you mean?
If you take a modern, beautifully smooth porcelain teacup, and you set it directly on the open flame of a gas stove, what physically happens?
It shatters violently, almost like an explosion.
Yes, that is due to thermal shock. When a rigid material is exposed to sudden extreme heat, the molecules on the hot side rapidly expand, while the cooler molecules on the other side remain static. This differential expansion creates immense internal stress.
And it cracks.
In a dense, tightly packed ceramic like porcelain, that stress has nowhere to go, so it forcefully rips the material apart, creating catastrophic fractures.
So how did a prehistoric clay pot survive being used as a literal, ongoing firebox, heating up to hundreds of degrees and then cooling down every single day without violently exploding in the middle of the house?
The answer lies in the specific recipe of the clay. The Jomana potters didn't just use pure river mud. They deliberately altered the material properties by adding something called temper.
Temper?
They crushed up coarse river sand, fragments of old crushed shells, and naturally occurring flakes of mica, and they kneaded this coarse aggregate directly into the wet clay. Furthermore, they fired these pots at what we consider a relatively low temperature for ceramics, around 900 degrees Celsius, in open bonfires rather than enclosed kilns.
In the past, I imagine traditional archaeologists looked at that low-temperature firing and the chunky sand inside the clay and viewed it as evidence of primitive incompetence. They probably thought, oh, they just didn't possess the technology to build a hot enough kiln to make strong, dense, refined pottery.
That was the assumption. But in reality, from a material science perspective, it was an incredibly sophisticated choice. By adding that coarse sand and keeping the firing temperature relatively low, the resulting ceramic matrix is highly porous.
It's not solid all the way through.
Exactly. It is not a solid wall. On a microscopic level, it is full of tiny air pockets and microfissures surrounding the grains of sand.
Why is porosity an advantage when you are dealing with fire?
Because those microscopic voids act as internal thermal shock absorbers. When the flame-style pot is subjected to the violent heat of a roaring fire, the clay matrix begins to rapidly expand. But instead of the stress building up and tearing the vessel apart, the internal material has physical room to flex and expand into those microscopic air pockets.
The voids arrest crack propagation.
They literally engineered a highly flexible ceramic material resilient enough to survive extreme daily thermal cycling without shattering.
It is just staggering when you pull back and look at the whole picture. We are looking at a single, unified piece of clay that acts as a secure firebox, a thermodynamically drafted ventilation system, a perfectly leveled trivet, a high-efficiency heat dissipator, an omnidirectional ergonomic safety grip, and a highly porous thermal shock absorber.
It is a masterpiece of integrated physical design.
But as with all human technology, environments change and eras come to an end. How did this unbelievable period of prehistoric engineering eventually fade away?
We see the decline and eventual disappearance of the flame-style pottery as the Jomon period slowly transitions into the Yayoi period, roughly around 300 BCE.
What changed?
The overarching climate shifted once again, but far more importantly, a massive wave of technological, agricultural, and cultural influence arrived across the sea from the Asian continent. The most defining change was the introduction of large-scale, wet rice agriculture.
And when you change the staple crop of a civilization, you completely change how they process food, and consequently, you completely change how they manage thermal energy.
Exactly. The arrival of rice fundamentally altered their domestic architecture. The most notable technological shift regarding cooking was the widespread introduction of the fixed indoor clay oven, known in Japanese history as the kamado.
So instead of having a portable, integrated clay vessel sitting in the middle of the dirt floor acting as the stove, they fundamentally changed the infrastructure of the house itself.
Right, they unbundled the physical functions. The kamado was a permanent, heavy structure built out of dense clay and stone, usually constructed directly against the wall of the dwelling. It was designed to contain the fire safely within a massive thermal mass, and it was built with its own dedicated, permanent draft openings for ventilation.
The architecture of the home became the firebox.
Which means the pottery no longer had to bear the burden of managing the fire.
If the house is now acting as the stove, what happens to the design of the pots?
The pottery is immediately stripped of all those complex thermal requirements. It no longer needs to be a trivet or a heat dissipator or an actively drafted firebox. Consequently, the pottery of the Yayoi period becomes vastly visually simplified.
The flames disappear.
We see the emergence of thin-walled, highly uniform, incredibly smooth pots, often with just a simple flange or lip around the middle. These new pots were specifically designed to simply sit flush inside the perfectly circular hole of the fixed kamado oven.
So the clay vessel returned to being just a simple container for boiling water and steaming rice.
Exactly. The explosive, chaotic art of the flame-style pot disappeared because its integrated survival engineering was no longer a physical requirement.
And this transition raises a profound anthropological question, one that I think is the emotional core of why we are doing this specific deep dive today.
The tension between art and utility.
Yes. When the Jomon transitioned to the Yayoi and they unbundled the functions, when they permanently separated the stove from the pot, stripping away the wild, chaotic beauty in favor of smooth, uniform efficiency, did humanity lose something fundamental about how we relate to the tools we create?
It is a question that challenges our modern sensibilities. The Jomon people managed to integrate breathtaking, expressive aesthetic beauty with pure, life-saving utility. They simply refused to separate art from science.
That pot was everything to them.
The heavy clay tool that literally kept their children alive through the freezing, snowy winters of the Ice Age aftermath was simultaneously the canvas upon which they expressed their cultural identity, their deep connection to the chaotic energy of their environment, and their sheer creative joy.
It wasn't just a machine.
Right. When humanity moved to the fixed oven and the plain, mass-produced smooth pot, we gained undeniable agricultural efficiency, absolutely. But we perhaps began the long, modern process of divorcing the things we use for survival from the things we find deeply beautiful.
But the underlying genius, the raw thermodynamic logic of the flame-style pot, didn't completely vanish from history, did it? The form changed, but the physics survived.
Yes, the legacy of that portable thermal management is remarkably resilient. If you skip forward thousands of years later into the Edo period and right up to the modern day in Japan, we see the widespread everyday use of the traditional portable clay stove, the shuchuan.
And if you analyze the anatomy of a traditional shuchuan, it utilizes the exact same thermodynamic principles perfected by the Jomon people. It features a contained, heavily heat-insulating clay firebox. It has specifically carved draft holes located at the bottom to actively draw in cold ambient oxygen. And it has built-in raised trivets at the top to support the cooking surface while allowing the exhaust to escape laterally.
The Jomon engineers were millennia ahead of their time, laying down the conceptual thermodynamic groundwork that is still utilized in modern cooking today.
So, what does this all mean? Let's bring this massive journey all together. We started this deep dive walking through a museum, looking at a wildly ornate, chaotic-looking piece of prehistoric pottery that traditional textbooks told us was just a frivolous ritual object born from a primitive, superstitious mind that didn't understand efficiency.
Which couldn't be further from the truth.
Right. By breaking down the laws of thermodynamics, material science, and the brutal reality of an Ice Age winter, we have completely inverted that perspective.
We have seen the undeniable physical evidence that the Jomon flame-style pottery was a highly calibrated survival instrument. It was a portable, ergonomically safe, heat-insulating, perfectly ventilated cooking stove. It was explicitly designed to leach lethal chemical toxins out of abundant forest forage, keeping humanity alive and thriving in one of the harshest, snowiest environments on Earth.
I want you, the person listening right now, to take a moment today and look closely at the physical objects in your own kitchen or workspace. Look at the specific curve of the handle on your favorite heavy cast iron pan. Look at the precise layout of the ventilation slots on your toaster. Look at the textured, rubberized grip on your chef's knife.
None of that is an accident.
Exactly. Every single one of those microscopic design choices, every vent, every texture, every curve has an ancient lineage. It is the cumulative result of thousands of years of human trial, brutal error, desperate engineering, and the sheer unyielding will to survive. You are surrounded every day by the invisible echoes of the Jomon potters.
And I will leave you with one final thought to mull over long after we sign off. When modern society designs a tool or a piece of infrastructure, our first instinct is usually to strip away all artistry in the absolute pursuit of pure clinical efficiency.
We want it sleek and minimal.
We reduce our tools to smooth beige boxes and sleek, featureless rectangles. We segregate our beautiful art to the quiet walls of galleries. And we relegate our functional tools to the dark corners of our cupboards. But the ancient Jomon people proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that maximum survival efficiency and breathtaking sculptural artistic expression can exist flawlessly in the exact same object.
They don't have to be separate.
What does it say about our modern world that we now view beauty and utility as mutually exclusive opposites? And how might we fundamentally redesign the future and the objects we interact with every single day if we learn to combine them once again?
That is an incredibly powerful question to end on. Remember how we started the show? We talked about how we naturally expect ancient tools to be like a simple, easily digestible equation, a sharp rock for piercing, a round bowl for water. We expect form to mechanically follow function.
But history is rarely that simple.
No, it isn't. But the Jomon flame-style pottery teaches us something infinitely more profound about human nature. When human ingenuity is pushed to its absolute breaking point by the cruelty of the environment, form doesn't just passively follow function. Form erupts. Form celebrates function. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the prehistoric engineering of survival. Keep questioning the physical world around you, keep looking closer at the things you take for granted, and we will catch you next time.